Hi, this is History with Andrew Allen, and this is my series, The Emergence of Europe, the Fall of the Roman Empire, the Rise of the Franks, and the Creation of Charlemagne's Empire. Today is episode 4. The Emperor finds a new Generalissimo, and Britain is abandoned. Before I forget, I include the names of the people I talk about and my sources in the description. As I explained last episode, Stilicho had made himself regent for Honorius, who was too young to rule. More interested in scheming to gain control of the Eastern Roman Empire, Stilicho failed to deal with an usurper in Gaul and a coalition of Vandals, Alans, and Suebi, which had crossed the Rhine. Finally, an adult Honorius had Stilicho executed. However, Alaric took advantage of the confusion to lead his Goths into Italy and sacked Rome after Honorius failed to give the Goths their own lands. Fortunately, Alaric died a year after the sack of Rome. Actually, the death of Alaric did not end the threat of the Goths. Alaric was succeeded by his brother-in-law, Athaeus, who simply led the Goths around Italy, hoping to find a home somewhere. Destruction followed the Goths, but it was probably a side effect rather than the objective. Remember, the Goths were not a tightly disciplined army. Rather, they were a loosely organized coalition of war bands that marched from town to town, spreading out to loot villas on the way. They were hungry, they did not view the land as their future home, and the existing authority that maintained stability had failed. Speaking of the imperial authority, it took time to find a replacement for Stilicho, but Flavius Constantius became Generalissimo in late 410. Like Stilicho, he had been born in the Balkans and had come over as part of Theodosius's army against the usurper Eugenius. Actually, Constantius had good luck since Constantine's general Gerontius broke with the usurper, presumably because he resented the decision to give Hispania to Constantine's son Constans rather than himself. Quick note, Hispania was the Roman name for the Iberian Peninsula, basically modern Spain and Portugal. Anyway, Gerontius was so annoyed by Constantine's blatant favoritism towards his son that he found his own candidate for emperor and drove Constans out of Hispania, which may explain why the Vandal coalition was able to cross the Pyrenees without a fight. Constantine may have simply wanted to let them fight his rebellious former subordinate rather than cause more trouble in Gaul. Regardless, the coalition and Gerontius seem to have come to terms because Gerontius marched north and soon laid siege to Constantine in Arles. Then Constantius appeared with an army. One would expect that the appearance of a shared enemy would motivate Gerontius and Constantine to patch things up, but apparently not. So Gerontius fought alone and was defeated. Since Constantine was still stuck inside the city, he soon surrendered. Somewhere on the way to Ravenna, Constantius apparently concluded that he did not need Constantine's body, so he just brought the usurper's head when he reported to the emperor. Stability had been restored. Great. Well, Gaul was a big place, and in 411, a Gallo-Roman senator named Jovinus declared himself to be emperor. He was supported by yet another tribe, the Burgundians, who were rewarded with lands on the Roman side of the Rhine. The arrival of these groups shows that the Western Roman Empire no longer had sufficient troops to guard the border. While the settlement of the Burgundians was a mutually beneficial arrangement, it was also a sign of acceptance of a new era. The barbarians had broken through the gates, but they were willing to settle down if they were given land. Undoubtedly aware of the massive destruction caused by the Goths as they wandered around Italy, Jovinus had clearly decided to limit the damage. In fact, he reached out to Athaeus through Attalus, hoping to expand his empire from Gaul to Italy. Actually, the Goths were already in Gaul, although their arrival was not necessarily good news for Jovinus. Why were the Goths in Gaul, you ask? Well, Athaeus had likely realized that Italy could be plundered but not conquered, so he had followed Attalus's advice and marched across the Alps in 412. Representatives from Constantius seemed to offer promises that the Goths would receive official recognition if they settled in southern Gaul, and Bordeaux did open its gates to the Goths. If the Goths had joined Jovinus, the combined army would have been unstoppable, but clearly Constantius had made a better offer. In exchange, Jovinus was captured in 413, and his head soon made its way to Ravenna without his body. So, there would be peace. The problems of multiple usurpers had been resolved, and the various Roman units that had backed the usurpers were now serving the emperor, represented by his Generalissimo Constantius. However, while these units contained numerous barbarian recruits, the large groups of Goths and Vandals roaming around were much too large to be absorbed into the army. So, could the army be rebuilt sufficiently to force the armed migrants to behave themselves? Actually, the lengthy invasion/migration had consequences in the furthest province of the empire. The invasions by the Goths, the Burgundians, and the other tribes had caused massive economic damage. The greatly reduced tax base naturally limited the amount of funds available to cover the expense of maintaining the border in Britain. After the usurper Constantine took much of the Roman army stationed in Britain with him to Gaul, local elites took control of much of the administration of the province. Fine, they probably understood the local environment better. However, local tax revenues were not enough to fund the remaining garrisons. Tax revenue from the empire was required, but Emperor Honorius had no money to spare. Technically, Britain was still part of the empire, at least until 410, when Honorius responded to an appeal for assistance with a statement that the cities would have to rely on themselves for their own defense. It needs to be stressed that this was the first time that a province of the empire had simply been abandoned. Honorius did not make a decision to pursue a policy of greater autonomy for Britain. He just reacted to events and hoped that it would be temporary. It wasn't. While the imperial government was still officially functioning, if barely, there were 3 separate tribal confederacies wandering around the Western Roman Empire: the Goths, the Burgundians, and the Vandals, Alans, and Suebi. These foreign coalitions were too weak to actually conquer the empire, but they had too many families to be fed by a single area. Therefore, they wandered around, further straining an already creaking system. It is worth contrasting the situation in the Western Roman Empire with the Eastern Roman Empire. As immigrant groups fled the Huns, the Eastern Roman Empire developed new social structures to absorb them, or at least maintain stability. When a large group of Goths was permitted to cross the border in the 420s, they were settled in Thrace as federates. Essentially, they promised to supply military units for the army, but those units maintained their existing political structures. Basically, the empire had abandoned any attempt at assimilation. Anyway, back to the Western Roman Empire. The Goths were the more immediate problem, since they had made themselves comfortable around Marseille and Narbonne, which may or may not have been the price for abandoning Jovinus. Just a quick note, I'm not trying to be vague, the records are simply not clear. Anyway, the Goths still lacked a formally recognized home, so Athaeulf improved his bargaining position by marrying Galla Placidia, daughter of Emperor Theodosius, in January 414. The ceremony took place in Narbonne, and the guest list included former Emperor Attalus. Wait, how had the Goths obtained the daughter of an emperor? Galla Placidia had been captured while trying to escape Rome during Alaric's siege, so she had been a well-treated captive for 3 years. The marriage to the younger half-sister of the emperor was supposed to legitimize the Goths' presence in Gaul, but Honorius did not seem pleased to learn that he had a new brother-in-law. He was probably even less pleased about the birth of a nephew, Theodosius, 9 months later. The decision to name the son Theodosius indicates a desire to enter the top level of the imperial hierarchy. Unfortunately, Athaeulf's position was less secure than he thought, since the Goths were starving, or at least very, very hungry. Then Theodosius died. The lack of a clear plan for the future caused a violent reaction among Atheos' followers, and he was murdered by Sojeric, a member of a rival family, in late August, early September 415. Sojeric lasted only a week before he was killed by Wallia, who negotiated an agreement where Placidia was exchanged for a lot of food. While the immediate threat of the Goths' imperial ambition had been resolved, they still needed land. At the same time, the Vandal coalition had made itself comfortable in Hispania, so no tax revenue reached Ravenna. Sometimes, two problems can solve each other. Constantius was unable to provide the Goths with a home, but he had a proposal. The Goths were promised a steady supply of food in exchange for clearing the Vandals and the Alans and the Suebi from Hispania. Constantius was rewarded with marriage to Placidia. So, Wallia led his Goths into Hispania, where individual members of the coalition had carved out their own territories. The Vandal faction closest to the Pyrenees was soon crushed, and the Alans took such heavy losses that they submitted to Gunderic, king of another tribe of Vandals, who had occupied Galatia. Hispania was a large place, so it would take time to complete the process of disciplining the coalition of Vandals, Alans, and Suebi, but Wallia received a new assignment roughly 2 years after he had marched south. In 418, the Goths were informed that they would be given the lands of southern Gaul from Toulouse to Bordeaux. Since the Goths had been effective in Hispania, why were semi-barbarians, or more accurately, independent military contractors needed in Gaul? Well, the region had become unstable following the breakdown in imperial order. There were raids from Bretons and Burgundians on the edges of the region, while the lower-class laborers had ignored the authority of the ruling class. So, the senators of Gaul had requested troops to provide security, both internal and external. Clearly, Constantius felt the pressure since he initiated the order to bring the Goths north from Hispania. I suspect that the senators were thinking of disciplined legions when they made their request, but the emperor had faced an unpleasant truth. Recognizing that the imperial army was no longer sufficient to defend the borders, tribes were allowed to settle in regions under their own kings in exchange for keeping other tribes out of the empire. Essentially, it was impossible to resist the waves of migration, so the empire chose the most stable group of barbarians. Honestly, this must have appeared bizarre at the time. Remember, these were the same people who had sacked Rome a handful of years earlier, but they were considered more stable than the other tribes? Hard to believe, but clearly Emperor Honorius had an even worse opinion of the tribes hovering around the borders. To be fair, the Goths had been consistent throughout their migration in Italy and Gaul. They wanted a stable home. Admittedly, they had frequently employed violence to make their point, but they had also negotiated, so maybe Honorius just gave up in frustration. Anyway, the Goths were settled in southwest Gaul, making Toulouse their capital in exchange for defending the region against other tribes. The region was probably selected because the Goths would be close enough to Hispania to intervene if the Vandal coalition became troublesome. Otherwise, the key factor was that the Goths had to live somewhere other than Italy. Finally, it would have been dangerous to settle them near the northern borders because they might have helped other barbarians cross over. Wallia died after they reached Gaul, and he was smoothly succeeded by Theodoric, the son-in-law of Alaric. Accepting the basic employment contract, Theodoric confined himself to Gaul, but he would use strong-arm tactics during the annual bargaining sessions over the size of the subsidies. Basically, he would lead an army against a major city in Gaul. There would be some fighting, a few people on each side would die, and the subsidy would be increased or not. I want to stress that Constantius deserves credit. He had inherited a dangerous situation that threatened to tear apart the Western Roman Empire, but within a decade he had ended the immediate threat to Italy, pacified part of Hispania, and restored order to Gaul. Still, Britain remained abandoned, and a greatly reduced amount of tax revenue arrived from Hispania and Gaul. Finally, the Rhine no longer served as a practical border, enabling the Franks, the Burgundians, and the Alemanni to cross at will. Could the Western Empire's army reconquer the lands? Unlikely. many of the legions had been destroyed resisting barbarian invaders or had died fighting during the numerous civil wars. Recruitment among the barbarian immigrant groups could rebuild those units, but it would take time and money. When Placidia and Constantius had a son named Valentinian in July 419, it was clear that their son would succeed Honorius as emperor, since Honorius did not have a child and seemed unlikely to produce one. So it was natural that Constantius was named co-emperor on February 8, 421. However, he died less than 7 months later. Well, Valentinian was still a potential heir, but Placidia and Honorius quarreled, so she and her son were exiled to Constantinople in 422. Honestly, this debate over the heir was a long-term problem, but Honorius needed a new Generalissimo immediately. The selection process would prove difficult since the rise of Constantius had been accompanied by the deaths of rivals within the court, so there would be no clear replacement. Actually, that is an understatement. The senior commanders below Constantius were his appointees, selected according to a mix of ability and loyalty. Once he was dead, the competition for the top job began, and it proved to be bloody. Well, the best way to prove that you were qualified to be Generalissimo is to win a victory. Boniface and Castinus, two of Constantius's senior generals, led separate armies against the Vandals in 422, but Boniface quarreled with Castinus over the exile of Galla Placidia and ended his expedition. Left alone, Castinus was defeated by the newly unified Vandal-Alan confederation. It may have only been a temporary setback, but before a stronger expedition could be organized, Honorius died in 423 and the senior Roman generals returned home to update their resumes and plot against rivals. Obviously, Valentinian would come back from Constantinople and rule. Well, he was 4 years old, so presumably his mother would bring him back and someone would be appointed regent. While that scenario undoubtedly sounded logical in Constantinople, the actual generals in the Western Roman Empire displayed little interest in being ruled by a child. Anyway, someone needed to take charge, and once again, local power brokers expressed an unmistakable desire to choose their own emperor. Castinus backed the application of John, the chief notary, to be emperor. No one else appeared to have applied, so John became emperor on November 20th, 423. One key supporter of the new regime was a general named Itius, who would become familiar with the barbarians because he had spent much of his childhood and adolescence as a hostage with barbarians, first Alaric's Goths and then the Huns. However, another key general refused to support John. Boniface seemed to recognize that he would not win, or more accurately survive the struggle to succeed Constantius, since his rival Castinus appeared dominant. Presumably hoping that distance would protect him, Boniface arranged to be appointed governor of North Africa in 422. Actually, given the breakdown in order, he probably simply declared himself governor. Anyway, he was safe in North Africa when Honorius died. Boniface remained loyal to Valentinian and cut off grain shipments to Italy. Still, Italy would not be safe for Valentinian while the usurper was in control. Fortunately, Valentinian's cousin Theodosius was emperor in the east. Naturally, Theodosius wanted to confirm that his young cousin would be welcome, so an army was first sent to ensure that there would be no potential rivals alive. That means John and Castinus, who were soon captured and executed. Once the usurpers had been killed and all of the blood had been mopped up, Valentinian returned with his mother in 425. Galla Placidia was regent, but she needed a generalissimo. To sum up, 3 separate groups of barbarians were wandering around the Western Roman Empire: the Goths, the Burgundians, and the Vandal-Alan-Suebi coalition. Desperate for troops, the emperor abandoned Britain, hopefully temporarily. The Goths attempted to improve their bargaining position through a marriage between their king and Galla Placidia, the half-sister of the emperor, but their son died and the king was killed by hungry followers. Constantius traded a lot of food for Placidia and convinced the Goths to deal with the Vandals and the Alans in Hispania. After a couple of years, the Goths were rewarded with lands in southern Gaul and Constantius married Placidia. The couple had a son named Valentinian, but Constantius died a year later. The search for a new Generalissimo had barely started when Honorius died. Placidia's son Valentinian was the natural successor, but the generals had little interest in being ruled by a child. So Theodosius, emperor of the Eastern Roman Empire, sent an army to solve the problem. Still, the empire was far from stable, and I will discuss the challenges faced by the new Generalissimo next episode. Thanks for listening. If you liked the episode and want to support me, I include a link to my Patreon in the description. Or you can buy me a coffee.